Welcome to the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. It's July 21st, 2019. The Bible Forum is here every Sunday night from 8 to 10 p.m. live. And of course, during the week, you can catch it on YouTube or on Facebook or on our website, thebibleforum.net. There's a carousel. It just keeps running. And from there, you can actually go and see other videos that you might have missed. The Bible Forum is a ministry of Alternatives, Biblical Counseling and Education, Incorporated. It's a 501c3 non-profit corporation, which means donations to this ministry are tax deductible. And we're asking that if you appreciate the ministry or you just feel God has laid it on your heart, you want to donate, we're here for you. And this will assure that the ministry will continue. All you have to do is go to our website, thebibleforum.net, click the donate button, and it'll take you to PayPal. You can use that, or you can email us, thebibleforum@gmail.com. I'll give you an address where you can send your donations. We got a lot of stuff, as you might know, not as much as we've had the last couple of weeks. The last couple of weeks, it's been kind of crazy, trying to weed out the things that we just don't have time for, try to get the most important stuff. This week was a little shallow, a little less. We could stand a little less here and there. What I wanted to share with you tonight was something I have entitled 666 here. It seems thousands of people in Sweden are having futuristic microchips implanted into their skin. This is to carry out everyday activities, a means of replacing credit cards and cash. Now, that ought to sound familiar. That's not really new. We've talked about this in the past. The Bible talked about it 2,000 years ago, and people scoffed. But now, apparently in Sweden, more than 4,000 people have already had these sci-fi-ish kinds of chips about the size of a grain of rice inserted into their hands, with the pioneers predicting millions will soon join them as they hope to take the whole thing global. The trend coincides with Sweden's march toward going cashless, with notes and coins now making up just 1% of Sweden's economy. At the same time, the country has seen a dramatic decrease in a number of crimes, with just 2 bank robberies last year compared to 110 in 2008. The problem with all of this is who owns the data? Do I get a letter from my insurance company saying premiums are going up before I know I'm ill? If I use the chip to buy lunch, go to the gym, go to work, will someone have all this information about me? Is it stored someplace secure, safe? Now the reality is we have learned that most of us will gladly swap security for convenience. Oh, and that too is a sign of the times. The sign of end times. What would you imagine would be the most hated Bible doctrine in the Bible? I would suggest to you in a word, it is the sovereignty of God. A woman in California learned another woman carried and gave birth to her son. Now that's all about fertility clinics. And apparently not all clinics are registered and regulated. And clearly not all are reliable. And apparently this happens more often than we know. And of course once is too many times. So what's the Bible doctrine that comes front and center in this story? Well, it's the sovereignty of God. Meaning God is able to make a barren womb produce a child. And should your child be born to a strange woman, as in this particular story, Would you be able to accept it as from a loving God? Now, the reality here is that nothing in this world happens without the approval or the outright involvement of God. Even the evil that exists is allowed by God. The Bible illustration is Sarah and Abraham. Sarah was in her mid-70s, Genesis chapter 16, before she gave birth the first time. Another Bible character is Abimelech. Abimelech was a ruler who took Sarah into his harem. When Abraham and Sarah left their land and went down into another kingdom, Abimelech was the monarch, and he saw Sarah, he took her. Now, the consequence here, the Bible says, was that every womb in Abimelech's household suddenly went barren, unable to conceive. And it happened as long as Sarah was there. Genesis chapter 20. Upon learning that she was Abraham's wife, he sent her back. And then Abraham prayed for Abimelech's wife, and she conceived. God controlling these things. Rebekah, Isaac's wife. Isaac prayed to the Eternal One, Genesis chapter 25. Didn't know his name. God answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah gave birth to twin boys, Jacob and Esau. In Judges chapter 13, we have Manoah's wife, barren, and yet she gave birth to Samson. God interceding. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, we see Hannah, whom Eli the priest saw weeping and praying there in the temple because she could not have a child. Eli said words along the line of, "Don't despair, God is able," that sort of thing. Hannah gave birth to Samuel. Hannah then gave Samuel back to the Lord. Samuel ended up being a judge over Israel for many years. Michal, King Saul's daughter, was the first wife of David. 2 Samuel chapter 6. She remained barren until her death. Why? The goal here was to make sure there were no descendants of Saul ever to regain the throne of Israel. She was Saul's daughter. The Shunammite woman in 2 Kings chapter 4, for whom Elisha prayed, and she gave birth. Elizabeth and Zacharias in Luke chapter 1. Elizabeth, well past her childbearing years, bore the prophet John, who we called John the Baptizer, a man who led the way for Jesus. And there have been, no doubt, many, many more instances when God overrode nature to provide children. The tentacles of this doctrine are many and varied, from relatively minor issues to those that are critical to God's purpose. But the point here is that God gives children. I ran into a woman just this week. She's been married 20 years, no children. She's a Bible-believing Christian. I encouraged her that God is still in charge. And she readily agreed. They're trusting God. Maybe God doesn't want you to have children. I want children. Maybe God doesn't want you to have children. There are stories in the Bible of people who went out and got what God would not give them. They were sorry. Here's a story of a woman bearing someone else's child in vitro fertilization. And the actors, the companies that manage all of this stuff are not being careful. Can you rejoice in this? It's possible the woman who gave birth to the child, learning that it was not her husband's sperm, didn't want the child either. And the woman who wanted the child was able to get her child, but it really wasn't her child fully. It gets crazy. These are highly emotional issues. I would encourage you not to get involved in this in vitro fertilization process and go through. Let God take care of it. But if you're going to go that route, let God be God. Don't go crazy. Recently, we learned that Facebook has banned an ancient biblical writing. TheBlaze.com reports that a Catholic writer said Facebook recently banned a quotation that he posted of St. Augustine of Hippo. Now, you may not have heard of Augustine of Hippo. This is a couple thousand years ago. St. Augustine is an early Catholic theologian who died in the 5th century. He's been called perhaps the most significant Christian thinker after St. Paul. And they read what he wrote and they called it hate speech. Dominic Bettinelli, Director of Community Engagement for Massachusetts Citizens for Life, wrote that the quotation is from St. Augustine's sermon contained in the official liturgical books of the Catholic Church as part of the Office of Readings for the 14th Sunday in ordinary time in the Liturgy of the Hours, the Divine Office. Now, you're Catholic, that all means something to you. It means nothing to me. But here's the quotation. St. Augustine said, "Let us never assume that if we live good lives, we will be without sin. Our lives should be praised only when we continue to beg for pardon. But men are hopeless creatures, and the less they concentrate on their own sins, the more interested they become in the sins of others. They seek to criticize, not to correct. Unable to excuse themselves, they're ready to accuse others." With that, Bettinelli said Facebook issued him a notice that the post, quote, "goes against our community standards on hate speech," end of quote. Now, the truth here is that this whole quotation is the opposite of hate speech. Hate speech, Bettinelli noted in his speech, this quotation is calling for people to stop focusing on other people's sins and concentrate on their own. Augustine is just reformulating the words of Jesus from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 7. "And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that's in your own eye?" Bettinelli appealed to have a human review his post, and he said it was still rejected as hate speech. It seems that Iran is attempting to blackmail the United States. And it is just that simple. The U.S. has accused Iran of a crude and transparent attempt to extort payments from the international community by violating the 2015 nuclear deal. The U.S. ambassador to the International Atomic Energy Agency said there was no credible reason for Iran to breach two key commitments on uranium enrichment. Iran has said the steps were a response to the sanctions the United States reinstated when it abandoned the deal last year, and it has vowed to reverse them if it is given compensation for economic losses. European powers still party to the deal have set up a mechanism for facilitating legitimate trade without direct financial transactions that they hope will circumvent the U.S. sanctions. However, Iran has said this does not meet their needs. Iran's representative of the United Nations in New York told the BBC that the Europeans could do more, and that if they did not, Iran would take further steps. Now keep in mind, soon after this post, Iran captured a ship in the Hormuz Straits they claim was attempting to pirate oil out of the region. Their oil? No, just out of the region. They claim the ship called for help, and Iran responded, towing the ship to an Iranian port for repairs, 12 crew members aboard. The ship is operating out of the United Arab Emirates under a Panamanian flag. We now have video of military types descending from a helicopter to board this ship. It did not look like a rescue mission. Stay tuned. The American Psychological Association has launched a task force that will encourage, quote, awareness and inclusivity, end of quote, for any kind of sexual impulse. This according to CBN News. The APA has said the task force is dedicated to, quote, consensual non-monogamy, end of quote, and is advocating for, quote, people who practice polyamory, open relationships, swinging, relationship anarchy, and other types of ethical non-monogamous relationships, end of quote. Finding love and or sexual intimacy, they say, is a central part of most people's life experience. However, the ability to engage in desired intimacy without social and medical stigmatization is not a liberty to all, they claim. This task force seeks, therefore, to address the needs of people who practice consensual non-monogamy, including their intersecting marginalized identities, end of quote. If you've got to go to that kind of verbal extent to explain and to justify what's going on, you got a problem. Andre Van Mol, a California doctor, co-chairman of the Committee on Adolescent Sexuality for the American College of Pediatricians, told the Christian Post that there is a, quote, cult of affirmation, end of quote, of people hoping to understand what he called marginal sexual behavior. In 1973, the APA removed homosexuality from its definition of mental disorders. In 2009, it officially rejected conversion therapy for those with same-sex attractions. The task force on so-called consensual non-monogamy is just more evidence that the American Psychological Association has lost its moral way. That, according to Liberty Counsel's founder and chairman, Matt Staber. The same people, he said, who want to deny counseling for people with unwanted same-sex desires or confusion also want to promote sexual anarchy and make open relationships a protected class. It's time to call out the APA for its unscientific bias, a bias that is quite harmful to people. Van Mol said he also worried about how much harm the APA changes could be making for future generations. There, meaning the APA, sexuality divisions have long since been taken over by extremists. And unless parents push back, it won't be long before this will be taught to our children in school with the usual emotional blackmail that to do otherwise is to stigmatize. I would add a note. It already has. Have you heard anything about the Christians in Nigeria? TheBlaze.com is reporting that David Curry, CEO of Open Doors USA, has declared the fate of Christians in northern Nigeria to be especially dire. Nigeria has an estimated 91 million Christians. And there's been a rise in Christian persecution in the last 10 years, with an average of 10 Christians a day being killed for their faith. Who's killing them? Muslims. There are these Islamic terrorist groups, he writes, with safe haven in the north, and the government has done little to nothing to root them out. That makes the north of Nigeria one of the most dangerous places for Christians. There's been an attack against Christian churches or groups at least once every 2 weeks. One of the most recent occurred on May 18, where Islamic extremists attacked a choir practice. 17 members are still being held captive. They claim we do not know who is alive and who is not. The women are either forced into marriage to jihadists. Under Sharia law, there is often nothing they can do to get those individuals back. Or they are ransomed to raise money for terrorist activities, or they're just simply killed. There are a number of things that can happen, and none of them are good, Curry said. Despite the attacks and Christian persecution, Curry said the Nigerian Christians are living out their faith in amazing and inspiring ways. When you think about praying around the world, think about your brothers and sisters in the Lord, not just in Nigeria, but all over the world, primarily in Muslim-controlled countries. Do you know who the Philistines are? Does it make a difference? The word Palestinian, which is bantered about freely today relative to the Middle East, is thought to have derived from the word Philistine. Although modern-day Palestinians say they did not originate from that people group. The Philistines often warred with the biblical Hebrews. Goliath, who was defeated and killed by David, was a Philistine. Archaeologist Eric Klein says that, quote, for more than a century we have debated the question of where the Philistines came from. Now we have the answer. That answer is southern Europe. Probably more specifically mainland Greece, Crete, or Sardinia. All of this fits with what had seemed to be the most likely answer previously, especially judging from the archaeological remains, and so this seems to be a logical finding. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says new DNA research indicates the biblical Philistines originated from Europe, bolstering the case that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. He quoted from Amos chapter 9, verse 7 and Jeremiah 47:4, which say the Philistines came from Caphtor, modern-day Crete, the Greek island in southern Europe. He says there's no connection between the ancient Philistines and the modern Palestinians whose ancestors came from the Arabian Peninsula to the land of Israel thousands of years later. Scientists studied the DNA of skeletons from a 3,000-year-old Philistine cemetery discovered in 2016 in Ashkelon, southern Israel, and published their findings last week in the journal Science Advances. The study showed DNA was related to the gene pool of southern Europe. 10 of the 108 skeletons had sufficient DNA to be used. All of this seems to be a moot case, and why are we even talking about it? It grows out of the world's effort, but the Palestinians' effort, the Arabs' effort, to demonstrate that they were there first. And the reality is they weren't. And every time something comes up that's in that realm, it proves that they're wrong. But it never stops them, because truth is not all that important, only winning. And they're winning. They're winning over a vast number of people around the world to their way of thinking. We hear it right in this country. People will stand up and they'll just talk about it like, oh, like this is my left hand. You know, Palestinians, oh, they were there first. No, they weren't. The Jews were out of town for about 1,000 years, but they came back. 1948, and they're stronger than ever. It's their country. God gave it to them. Got proof. They don't.